So we are on our second handout now, Lecture 2, and we're going to talk about each of the 6 concupiscible passions in a little detail to try to understand them more, how they operate. So we begin with the passion of love. Love is the most fundamental, the most basic of all the passions. Aquinas says it's the first principle or starting point of all the other passions. You couldn't have any other passion, ultimately, if you didn't have the passion of love. Love is the cause of all of the other passions in some way, which means that at the most basic level, as human beings, we are creatures who are moved most fundamentally by love, by the good that we've been created for. Aquinas writes this in his Summa: nobody desires anything except as a loved good, nor does anyone rejoice except in the loved good, nor does hate concern anything except what is contrary to the loved good. Similarly, it is manifest that sorrow and other things like it are referred to love as their first principle. In whomever there is will and appetite, there must be love. If love is removed, all the rest is removed. Love is the foundation, our basic inclination for the good that completes us in all kinds of different ways. Now, to talk about the passion of love is a little tricky because the term love is used so ubiquitously and in a lot of different ways, even theologically. We think about charity, the highest form of love. That's something very different or much higher than, distinct from the passion of love. We can think about different other forms of love that are choices. The love of friendship, I choose to exist in a friendship with another, to share the love of friendship with another. Those are choices. Here we're talking about love as a passion, this basic, lowest movement in the soul, not a movement of the will. So try to keep that distinct. We're not talking about a choice. Love is a choice, which is distinct. But here, a response to something that moves our soul at this lowest level. So the passion of love is, Aquinas says, a principle of motion, something that moves us toward the thing that is loved. It's essentially an act of responding to the reality of goodness in a thing, but a goodness that resonates with me. You know, there's all kinds of good things in the world, but not all of them resonate with me, connect with me in the same way. I'm not a coffee drinker, so the good of coffee doesn't resonate with me. There's a good in coffee. A lot of people love coffee. That doesn't do much for me. I like tea, so tea resonates with me. So the good that we respond to has to have some connection to us, some ability to resonate with us. We have to have a certain affinity for it. And that can be by nature. By our nature, we have affinity, a natural resonance with certain things. But also in our individual human lives, we develop other personal, you might say, tastes for what we love and what we don't like so much. Aquinas calls this co-naturality, something that becomes co-natural to us, or like a second nature to us. Something that resonates, fulfills me in some way. So think about this, the most basic and general way that you use the word love. I love pizza. I love my dog. I love my parents. On and on and on. All the different goods that resonate with me, that complete me in some way. It doesn't have to be the good that completes you absolutely. Only God is the summum bonum, the highest good that absolutely satisfies us. But even pizza fulfills me in some way. It can complete something in me at a certain moment. I have a certain affinity for it, and so I can love it. There are certainly, as I've said, higher kinds of love. Willed love, the love of friendship, romantic love, the love of God in charity. But all of them, this is significant, all of them are rooted in the passion of love, in this lowest basic inclination of being drawn to the good that I have an affinity for. In each and every case of love, even higher loves, love is about this basic inclination of the subject toward the object that's apprehended as suitable to me, as completive, fulfilling for me. So you might have heard the saying, sometimes Catholics say this, that love is not a feeling, love is a choice. It's an act of the will. That's not actually correct. Love is both. Love is a feeling. It is an emotion. It's a passion. And Aquinas says this is the most fundamental meaning of love, the most foundational, upon which the higher forms of love cannot stand. It's wrong to want to get rid of, the emotion of love and just say, I choose to love. Yes, we do need to choose to love, even when our passions might not be inclining us to love, because there's still disorder in our passions. We do need to make a choice at times. But we shouldn't pit these two against each other, willed love and felt, affective love. Basically, what Aquinas is saying here is that God has designed the soul in a multifaceted way, and all of this is meant to work together. The passion of love is that basic fuel, energy moving us toward the good that in some cases then is such a high good that we can choose and set our will on in a permanent way. But he says the highest kinds of love cannot stand without the lowest, the passion of love. God's design of our nature is not in vain. It's not something we should be ignored. So the emotion of love, the passion of love, is a good thing. However, it's very easy for that passion to get out of order and to love things that I really shouldn't love, to see goodness in a thing that's not really good for me, to develop even a kind of affinity for something that isn't completive of me, that's not suitable for me. If love is the most basic fundamental passion, it's also the passion that is susceptible to the deepest kind of disorder and needs the deepest healing by grace and virtue. So Aquinas considers the causes of the passion of love. What, you might say, arouses this passion in you? What causes you to be moved by the passion of love? He notes three different things. The most fundamental thing is good. You can't be moved to love unless there is a good, or at least the perception of a good. If you're perceiving evil, you're not going to be moved to love. You're going to be moved to hatred. It is the good that evokes the response of love. Good is the proper cause of love. And the more good a thing is, the more lovable it is. And the more it should elicit love in us. So yes, you can love your dog, but your son or daughter has even more goodness, is a higher creature than your pet, and so they should elicit an even deeper love, a higher kind of love, and all the more so with God. All right, so good is the first cause of love. You wouldn't love anything if there wasn't goodness in the thing, or at least the perception, your apprehension of goodness. And this can be part of the healing. If you have disordered love for something, really examining, thinking about, well, how good is this thing, and how good is it for me? Is this really suitable for me? Say a relationship. I become friends with this person, and, well, it's actually not really a great relationship. We don't really, it's not a relationship that's leading to virtue. And I might have to examine, well, is this love, the passion of love and the choice to be friends with this person, is it really rooted in a suitable good, or something that appears to me to be good but really is something I'd be better off without? So good is the first cause of love. Secondly, very significantly, knowledge. Knowledge is a cause of love. Now, this has to do with Aquinas' basic anthropology, that the will, if we're talking about higher loves here for a moment, the will has to be moved by the intellect, meaning in order to choose to give yourself in love to someone, you have to know goodness. The will is blind, you could say. It has to see, be informed by the intellect. You cannot love what you do not know, St. Augustine says. You cannot love what you do not know. If good is the proper cause of love, you have to have some knowledge of that goodness. You have to see it, apprehend it in some way, which can happen at the intellect. It can also happen on the lower level. The senses, we haven't talked about that. The interior senses, it's a little more complex. But you have to apprehend this goodness so that you can then respond in love. Now, it's worth considering for a moment this rather complex and nuanced relationship between knowledge and love. Most basically, knowledge comes before love. Knowledge moves one to love. The more you know, the more you can love. Knowledge is a precondition for love. However, Aquinas makes clear that you only have to have some knowledge, some apprehension of the good in order to love it. And that in fact, love naturally, you might say, outruns knowledge. Love goes beyond the degree to which you know something. So think, for example, about how you could have minimal knowledge of another person. Say a mother has really very minimal, very, very, very minimal knowledge of her 3-day-old daughter. This human person, your child, you don't know that soul. You know the reality of it, the goodness of it, but you don't know it in the way that you'll know your daughter when she's 30 years old. And yet you can love to a degree that far outruns the actual knowledge that you have. You have to have some knowledge of the goodness, but love can far outrun knowledge. This is very important, Aquinas says, for understanding our relationship to God. He writes, "A thing is loved more than it is known. It can be loved perfectly, even without being known perfectly. This applies to the love of God," he says. We cannot have perfect knowledge of God in this life. That is what the beatific vision is. In heaven, we will see God face to face, and we will know him as fully and completely as we can know him in our finite capacity, with our finite intellect. We will have perfect knowledge of God in heaven alone, but in this life, it is possible to have perfect love of God without perfect knowledge. It requires some knowledge of God, but it is possible, by God's grace, to have perfect love of him, even here and now without perfect knowledge. And so too we can think of other relationships in lesser degrees. Normally speaking, the more you know another, the more you can love. But at the same time, love is a primary motive force to impel you to come to know the person more deeply that you love. The more I love another, the more I want to know that other. Love necessarily presses forward, somewhat in a manner akin to intoxication. Speaking internally here about, the intoxication of love. You want to know as much as you can about the beloved so that you can be more perfectly united. Aquinas says this: the lover is not satisfied with a superficial apprehension, knowledge of the beloved. The lover strives to gain an intimate knowledge of everything pertaining to the beloved so as to penetrate into his very soul. So the more you love, the more you're compelled to know the one you love. So there's something of a cyclical relationship here between knowledge and love. You can't have love without some knowledge, but that love moves you to come to know more, and that knowledge can lead you to love more, and on and on and on. Ultimately, this is what our life with God is meant to be like. The more we love him, the more we can come to know him, and not necessarily even by our intellects, but by the gift of wisdom that he infuses in us, by which we can see, understand him more deeply. So knowledge is a cause of the passion of love. And then thirdly, likeness is a cause of love. Because anything that arouses the movement of love in me somehow has to bear a likeness to me. If it didn't, it couldn't make contact with me, connect with me in any way. There has to be some degree of likeness in order for there to be some degree of connection. Aquinas writes this about friendship between man and God. Since likeness is the cause of love, likeness causes love, there cannot possibly be any friendship between man and God, who is supremely good, unless we become good. In order for us to be friends with God, we have to become like God. This, he says, is why it is written, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." The more we become like God, the more that causes a union of love, the more we can be united to him. God created us in his image and likeness. That image was marred by original sin, not destroyed, but marred. And in one way, you can think of the entirety of the Christian moral life as the restoration of that image by God's grace. The full restoration and shining of that image of God in us. Because the more we're like him, the more we can love him. We can be united to him. Because likeness causes love. It allows for a deeper and deeper connection. Okay, then he considers different effects of love, of this primary passion. The first and most significant is union. Union is the necessary effect of love. Even my love of pizza results in the union between myself and pizza, the bodily union, even if it's temporary. Love draws you to be united with that which you love, whether we're talking about something physical, something spiritual. Now, if we're talking about persons, in what sense are the lover and the beloved united? They can't actually be united at the level of their essence. So say in marriage, the most profound kind of union between persons we have in the natural order, two married persons don't actually come to share one and the same essence, such that there's no longer two persons, but metaphysically, there is only one essence. No, there are two souls still created in God's image. So there's not a metaphysical union at the level of essence. So far from what you might hear talked about sometimes as a kind of mystical loss of the self, that you're entirely swallowed up in union with another. Aquinas says that the union that obtains between lover and beloved is the union of presence. The union of presence. He says that you live together, you speak together, you're united together in all like things. You share your lives together. This kind of union is the union between lover and beloved, because the lover and beloved remain ultimately distinct, two distinct beings. Neither of them can be entirely engulfed in the other, contrary to a kind of foolish romanticism that believes that, real N loves in becoming the other or something like that. Your soul will always be a unique soul created by God. Even in your union with God, your soul, even divinized by God in heaven, is a singular substance. However, there is the possibility of profound union, even between souls, especially between souls, a union of presence, to share life together in deeper and deeper ways. This will be consummated in heaven, to share life with God, union, to be as one. The second effect he talks about is mutual indwelling. That love affects this kind of mutual indwelling. The lover is said to be in the beloved, and the beloved to be in the lover, all the while without negating this actual distinctness of persons. He writes this: the beloved is contained in the lover by being impressed on his heart, and thus becoming the object of his complacency, his rest. On the other hand, the lover is contained in the beloved inasmuch as the lover penetrates into the beloved. For this reason, we speak of love as being intimate. So there is a profound way in which love can result in a real impression of one person upon another. a deep intimacy wherein one is really impressed deeply on the heart of another. Another effect of love is ecstasy. It comes from the word ecstasis. Ecstasis means to stand. Stare, stasis, comes from to stand outside of oneself. That love causes one to stand or to be outside of himself. It draws you out of yourself. When a person loves another for that other's sake, not for my own sake, but for the sake of the other, he transcends his tendency to desire things merely as a means for his own use, and in a sense, he goes out of himself. He gets over himself, and he loves the other for the sake of the other. This is ultimately what charity is about, loving God for God's own sake, not because God is good to me, because God gives me good things, loving God because he is God, for the good, the ultimate good that he is. We have to get out of ourselves, stand outside of ourselves in order to have that kind of love. Aquinas says that he who loves goes out of himself insofar as he wills the good for another and works toward it. Insofar as I'm concerned with the good for another and not only my own good, I'm stepping outside of myself. And the passion of love can move us to do this. It can affect this in us. If I love someone, I'm moved by the passion of love. It can move me to will that person's good, to step outside of myself, to forget about myself. Finally, there is zeal. Zeal, he says, is the natural effect of love, and it's the most trustworthy sign of love. How do you know if love is really real? If you have zeal for the beloved. If zeal is lacking, it says a great deal about the supposed love that exists. If a man professes to love a woman, but remains consistently unmoved in the face of obstacles to her good, his claim to love her is very doubtful. If he's not moved zealously to act for her good, how deep and significant is that love? So too with God. When a person's love is rightly directed to another's good, Aquinas says, it causes a man to be moved zealously against whatever opposes the good of that person, to be moved against whatever is an obstacle for that person. In this way, too, he says, a man is said to be zealous for God when he endeavors, to the best of his ability, to repel whatever is contrary to the will of God. True love brings about a zeal to fight against the obstacles to that good, to repel the obstacles to the good of the other, even for God, to be zealous for God. Love moves us. Not only are we moved to stand outside of ourselves, to will the good for the other, but we're moved to fight against the obstacles of that good in zeal for the other. So those are some of Aquinas' ideas about the passion of love, how love moves us in different ways toward that object, all those objects that have some resonance of goodness for us. And there's a huge spectrum here, from the lowest kinds of goods to the very highest. But all of them, in the most basic way, are meant to arouse this movement of love in our souls, which then can lead to higher choices of love as well. The contrary of this passion is the passion of hatred. Is the passion of hatred evil in itself? No. Rightly ordered love entails that some things be apprehended as repugnant rather than befitting. Some things are to be hated not in and of themselves, but insofar as they are hostile to the required good. If something is hostile to the good that is necessary, then it should be hated. I naturally love my own life, and so I naturally hate someone who tries to deprive me of my life. You should have a natural response of hatred to someone who is hostile to the good of your life. Our Lord says, if anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. What does this mean? These are goods that aren't to be hated in and of themselves, but they are to be hated, he says, insofar as they are hostile to the required good, to what is required to follow Christ. If father or mother, the highest, the best of human relationships becomes an obstacle, an impediment to following Christ, they are to be hated. No one comes to me without hating that which is an obstacle to the good. So the passion of hatred is the appropriate sensitive response at times. It's the legitimate corollary to love. Now, evil is the direct cause of hatred. Good is the direct cause of love. Evil is the direct cause of hatred. Evil is the privation of a good, the lack of a good. In any given instance, when we are being concretely deprived of the good that we love, we experience hatred. If I'm being concretely deprived of the good that I love and desire, if I'm being deprived of my life, or some other lesser good, I experience hatred. We hate anything that makes it difficult for us to attain what we love. That evil in some way prevents us from coming into union with the object of our love. Now, there's no question that hatred can exert itself very powerfully upon us. We can feel hatred very deeply. However, St. Thomas is nonetheless convinced that in the final analysis, love is the strongest passion, not hatred. Love is the strongest and deepest passion, because hatred only exists because of a prior love. We hate that which is an obstacle to our love, to our good. Now, he does acknowledge, he is a realist and really a profound psychologist. He acknowledges that our experience of hatred, our feeling of hatred, can be more palpable at times than our experience of love. It might feel more gripping at times than our experience of love. But in the order of causality, love is stronger than hatred because causes are stronger than effects. And turning away from evil in hatred is invariably an effect of our turning toward a good in love. We only hate because we have a prior love. Hatred is more sensibly experienced at times, just like the lack of a good, an absent good, is at times more strongly experienced even than the presence of that good. Sometimes you experience desire for a good much more strongly than when you actually obtain that thing and find pleasure in it. Now, the passion of hatred, it's a natural thing, a natural corollary to love, arises when there are obstacles to that which we love. But the passion of hatred should not be cultivated as something that's good in itself. It can be a good response at times, can be an appropriate response, but we shouldn't try to stir up hatred. Even, as you might sometimes hear, sometimes, Catholics are encouraged to kind of foster this hatred of sin. Sin should be hated. It is an obstacle to our good, which is God. However, Aquinas would not agree that we should expend a lot of energy trying to foster and cultivate hatred. We should hate when that evil is present to us or when we consider it. But why? Because of the absolute prioritization of the good. The good is always stronger than evil, such that in the final analysis, it's a waste of time to spend the majority of your time hating what is evil. You should spend the majority of your energy and time loving the good. That will be more powerful to draw you along your way. We don't need to cultivate a kind of exaggerated repugnance. What we need to cultivate is a deeper and deeper love for the good. In the end, good will take you much, much further than evil. I often say to people that the Christian life is not ultimately about overcoming sin. Sin is an obstacle to God, but this evil is not the terminus of the Christian life. The Christian life isn't fundamentally about getting over evil. It's about our union with God. Now, that's an obstacle that has to be overcome on the way. But if we spend all of our time and attention worrying about overcoming sin, we can fail to take advantage of all of the opportunities we have to grow in union with God, which, by the way, is the only ultimate way we overcome sin, by God's action within us. We shouldn't spend all of our time concerned about evil. We should focus our attention and our energies on the pursuit of the good, on the pursuit of God, and let Him conquer evil within us as only He can do. This is not to say we should have no concern for sin, but there can be an exaggerated concern for sin such that we don't give ourselves sufficiently to our pursuit of union with God, friendship with Him, prayer, living in union with Him. All right, so that's a few words about hatred. On to desire. This is the passion that is also known as concupiscence. It's another word for desire. It's the passion from which this whole set of passions gets their name, the concupiscible passions, because we experience desire, concupiscence so strongly. Just keep in mind, though, because we also had concupiscence on the board when we were talking about the wound of original sin to the concupiscible passions, which is called concupiscence. You get a lot of duplication of terms sometimes. There's a distinction between disordered concupiscence, which is a wound of original sin, immoderate seeking of pleasure, and concupiscence in itself, which is just the natural desire we have for an absent good. So concupiscence is not always evil. Most basically, it's a natural thing, desire. Now, desire is not simply about this attraction to a good. It is specifically about an absent good, something we don't have. When the good is apprehended as present to us, then we have pleasure. But if that good is seen to be absent, it arouses love and then the movement of desire. We're moved towards it in desire. Aquinas makes a distinction here between two different kinds of concupiscence or desire. He says concupiscence is the craving for pleasurable good. Now, a thing is pleasurable in two ways. First, a thing is pleasurable because it's suitable to the nature of the animal. For example, food, drink, and sex. These are things suitable to us. We're made for these. Of course, we can pursue them immoderately, but on the most basic level, these are natural concupiscences. We have natural desires for things that we're naturally made for. But the second kind of concupiscence deals with things that are pleasurable because they are apprehended as suitable to me. They're not suitable on the most basic level of my nature as water is suitable to me, but I can apprehend something. I can think about and come to the conclusion that this thing is suitable for me. This, he says, is not a natural concupiscence. There's something artificial here. It's not necessarily a bad thing. However, it can be a locus, a place here for great disorder to enter in. First, in the first case, things that aren't naturally suitable to me but become desirable. For example, not that I know anything about this, but it's an example that one writer used. Someone who's trained as a classical ballerina has to retrain all kinds of muscles and movements in her body to act in a way that's really not naturally suitable, but becomes desirable because of how it's apprehended, the beauty with which this kind of movement is apprehended. Or a more mundane example, the bitter flavor of coffee is not immediately, naturally suitable, but you can certainly develop a taste for it, and it becomes something that becomes suitable to you. When I first tasted bourbon, did not find it suitable, pleasurable at all. But then you keep drinking and over time, well, now all of a sudden this is pleasurable. You know what happened? It takes time, but you can develop tastes, particular tastes for things. Now, unfortunately, this can also work in the opposite direction. This opens the door widely to all kinds of unnatural pleasures. A person can interpret, can apprehend in his mind a thing to be pleasurable, which in reality is in no way pleasurable at all. But a person can apprehend it as such, and therefore can desire it, because he has apprehended it. Aquinas uses a very extreme example of cannibalism. You can, by way of all kinds of other disorders in the soul, apprehend this activity as being pleasurable, and therefore develop a desire for it. He also uses the example of sodomy. And you can think of all kinds of other unnatural pleasures, things that we are not made for and which in fact are destructive of our nature, contrary to our nature, that people can find pleasure in because of how much the mind can be part of our evaluation of pleasure. And the body can become habituated to acting in all kinds of ways that it wasn't naturally made for. So, desire is a place where the passions can really go astray in significant ways because of the energy of desire. It's one thing to have a disordered love, but if you combine that with disordered desire, that pushes you into this thing that you have a disordered love for. And the stronger that disordered desire, the deeper and deeper the hole gets. Desire, however, most fundamentally, is meant to be a strong impetus and energy for us in our pursuit of the true good. That if we desire rightly, we're fueled, we're pushed toward the possession, the union with that good in really significant ways. Our whole being is propelled forward. Now, the contrary of desire is aversion. The passion of aversion. If an evil, something I apprehend as evil, is absent from me, if it's far away, not present, not really pertinent, it doesn't really give rise to a desire, a passion that's much worth speaking about. Aquinas doesn't even have one question on the passion of aversion. He names it, gives a definition, but he doesn't consider it at all. It's not significant in the moral life because the evil is far away from you. So it plays too trivial a part if this evil is really very absent from you to be very concerned about it. It can be easily avoided. For example, when I lived in Italy, I had the great misfortune once of being served tripe at dinner. This horrible, horrible piece of, the lining of a cow's stomach, all porous and gooey and slimy, and it was just absolutely an absolute cause of hatred. However, if this tripe, which I have a real hatred for, is not present to me at all, if it's far away from me, well, it's not significant to me. It's not on my mind. It doesn't play a significant role in my life. However, if Sister puts tripe on the menu for dinner at the refectory, then the passion that arises in me is not aversion, but fear. Now we have an arduous, very arduous evil that we have to avoid. So aversion doesn't have a very significant role to play because the things you have an aversion for are not present to you. They're easily avoided. All right, so moving on to pleasure. The passion of pleasure. It's important to realize here that pleasure with regard to the good and sorrow with regard to evil, these are what we call the terminus, the stopping point, the resting point of the passions. So the movement begins with love and desire, but once you have it, then you have reached the resting point. So too with something you hate. If you're enduring it presently, well then you're at this resting point, this terminus. So pleasure is the positive terminus of the concupiscible appetites. It's the state of resting and delighting in the good that you now possess, the good that is now present to you, even if it's only for a few moments. It's important here to distinguish, Aquinas distinguishes between two things, delight and joy. Delight is really synonymous with pleasure. So pleasure or delight and joy, they're not exactly the same thing. We can take delight or pleasure both in things that we desire naturally when we get them, and in things that we desire as a result of reason, as a result of thinking about them, as a result of willing it. But joy is something that only exists in the upper part of the soul. Joy follows upon reason. In order to experience what he calls intellectual joy, you have to be thinking and willing. It's not just the basic bodily delight of possessing a good. So pleasures, bodily pleasures especially, only require basic sense apprehension, something that is accompanied by some change in the body. But rational animals, human beings, can also uniquely experience intellectual joy, and the body can remain unaffected. So he says that whatever can be the object of delight, the bodily level, pleasure, can also be the object of joy. I can take joy in my mind, find joy in what I am delighting in my body and soul. But not everything that's an object of joy, everything that I can think about and consider as a worthy object of joy, is something I necessarily feel delight about in my body. This is important because it's possible and necessary, really, in the Christian life to have joy in the soul even while you are experiencing pain in the body. You can't experience pain and pleasure in the body at the same time, in the same way. But you can simultaneously be experiencing bodily pain or suffering, sorrow, and intellectual joy. Think about, all the accounts we have of the martyrs who are suffering incredible bodily torments, but their soul is filled with joy. Even though they're experiencing excruciating pain, their soul is filled with joy because they know the truth, that they are suffering for Christ and in union with him. Suffering is not an absolute obstacle in the Christian life because it never necessarily impedes joy. We can live in joy with Christ, even though we're not always going to be living in pleasure. Suffering is an obstacle to pleasure, but we're not made for pleasure always and everywhere. But we can have joy. And the Christian life, as the saints tell us, is meant to be a life of joy. St. Teresa of Avila said, God save us from dour saints. We're meant to live with joy of belonging to Christ, even and especially while we may be suffering pain for Christ. So there's a distinction here between pleasure in its most basic sense, something that is experienced in and through the body, and the joy that we can have in the higher parts of our soul because we can know the truth, and we can find joy in knowing of our union with Christ. That's something that's unique to us as rational animals. Lower animals cannot experience joy. They certainly experience pleasure, but they can't know intellectual joy. All right. Now, what are the effects of pleasure? He talks about 4 different effects of pleasure. Pleasure is a significant passion. How many people's choices are motivated by the desire for pleasure, by the pleasure as an ultimate goal? What does pleasure bring about? First, he says, pleasure brings about a kind of expansion. He means that the powers of the soul are enlarged by pleasure. Now, he does acknowledge some somatic effect. He speaks about a kind of literal enlargement of the heart, but he's really not interested here in the physical, but in a spiritual effect, and he uses this biological metaphor. That when we have pleasure, the spiritual effect of enlarging our heart is brought about. St. Catherine of Siena speaks similarly about suffering, that suffering that is born of love doesn't shrivel up the soul. She says it makes the soul grow fat. Suffering born of love expands the soul, makes more room for God. So too, in the basic sense, does pleasure. Pleasure, because we find such rest and delight in it, it has this kind of, he's speaking metaphorically here, this kind of effect of expanding us so that we can enjoy that effect even more. The point is that in order to attain our ultimate end, God, and the enjoyment of God, our heart has to be opened, expanded more and more and more. Aquinas says this: he that takes pleasure in a thing holds it fast by clinging to it with all his might, and he opens his heart to it more and more that he may enjoy it ever more perfectly. St. Augustine says, enlarge your hearts. Well, one of the ways in which our hearts are enlarged is with pleasure, especially pleasure in the highest goods, the spiritual goods. Taking pleasure in the things of God has a way of expanding our heart, giving us an even greater capacity for God and for the enjoyment of God. For Aquinas, the most powerful agent for opening wide the heart is joy. Expanding the heart. Spiritual joys expand our hearts in order to prepare us to receive still greater pleasure and joy in the life to come. The more we take delight in the highest goods, the more our capacity for taking delight in the good expands, so that ultimately we can receive more and more of God. So that's one effect of pleasure, this kind of expansion, growing fat, the heart growing fat, St. Catherine says. Another effect is the desire for more pleasure. This is just a natural effect of pleasure. When you experience pleasure, it produces the effect of a desire for more pleasure. So you can remember past pleasures, and that can produce the effect of desiring that pleasure again. Or a present good might only be possessed incompletely, and the pleasure generated from that spurs you on to the desire for more pleasure, a more complete fulfillment of that pleasure. Think about how our attainment of the goods, different goods in this life, is often successive, something that exists in time. So, the pleasure of listening to a beautiful piece of music, this is something that exists successively. So the more I get into a Bach's St. John Passion, the further I listen, the more my desire for that pleasure grows. I want that pleasure to be completed. Another effect of pleasure, and this is where pleasure can become an obstacle to our good, another effect of pleasure is that pleasure can hinder the use of reason, our highest power, our intellect. Spiritual joy, spiritual pleasure does not hinder the use of reason. Finding spiritual pleasure in the spiritual goods of God doesn't hinder our reason. That kind of pleasure, actually, Aquinas says, helps us. It makes us even more attentive, more engaged with what we're doing. But bodily pleasures can interfere with reason. He says in 3 different ways bodily pleasures can interfere with the right working of reason. First, by way of distraction. When we attend with all of our energy to that which pleases us, we ignore other things. So if I'm focusing all my attention on this gallon of ice cream that I'm eating, I ignore other things like, my blood sugar is going through the roof, and we can distract ourselves by bodily pleasures to things that reason should be considering. Secondly, he says, by reason of contrariety, something a contrary opposed, some pleasures, especially those of excess, are contrary to right reason. Excessive bodily pleasures are very prone to destroy the working of prudence. Prudence is about judging right action. Excessive bodily pleasures can strongly undermine the use of prudence, and Aquinas thinks that lust, excessive sexual pleasure, the greatest of bodily pleasures, most undermines prudence, makes people most imprudent about their actions. So bodily pleasures that are immoderate, excessive, can undermine our ability to make good, wise, moral choices, prudent decisions. So there's distraction, there's contrariety. Thirdly, he says, pleasures can interfere with use of reason according to a certain binding, a certain fettering of reason. This is when the activity of reason is entirely destroyed for a time. He's thinking here of drunkenness. There are certain bodily pleasures that can really shut down the use of reason. If you're so inebriated that your mind can't function, this is a great problem. Reason is meant to direct all of our actions, so it's possible, say, with alcohol, drugs, with excess and abuse of these things, to really inhibit the use of reason altogether. So bodily pleasure can be dangerous. It can cause those who know better to fall into sin, especially when one convinces himself that pleasure is really my ultimate goal. And this is going to bring me pleasure, and so I pursue it. However, even though harmful bodily pleasures are a problem, bodily pleasure in itself is a good. Pleasure is a good passion. It's natural, and it's meant to move us to the good. If we didn't find pleasure in food and drink and sex, if we didn't take pleasure, the natural pleasure that God attached to these natural goods, it would be very difficult for us to preserve our own lives and the life of the species. If we found repugnance in food, drink, and sex altogether, well, the history of humanity would have been very short. God attached pleasure to these goods so that we would be led to the preservation of a deeper good, our life and the life of the species. So bodily pleasure is a good thing. It can be abused, it can be disordered, but in itself it's good. It signals to us that we have attained some good, something that is actually suitable to us. Now, Aquinas talks about the good effect of pleasure here in terms of perfecting operation. He says a person is drawn to an activity by perceiving that it is delightful in some respect. So appropriate pleasure, good pleasure, increases activity. It draws us into the activity even more. So pleasure's capacity to distract reason or work against reason when things are out of order is matched by its power to increase the intensity of what we're doing. We give ourselves more intensely to a good thing because we find pleasure in it. We're able to perform the action even better when we find pleasure in it. This is, again, something of the distinction between the kind of cold, continent person and the virtuous person energized by the power of the passions. If I find pleasure, the continent person doesn't find pleasure in doing the good. If I find pleasure in doing the good, it helps me to do it even better, to give myself to it even more entirely and wholeheartedly. That is what the life of virtue is meant to bring about in us. So very simply, there is good pleasure when the soul delights and rests in something that's in accord with our true good, known by right reason and God's law. And there is evil pleasure when the soul delights and rests in something that is contrary to our true good, contrary to right reason and God's law. All right, the last concupiscible passion then is sorrow or pain. Aquinas talks about both. So we'll see sorrow is the higher, more spiritual notion of the passion. Pain is something more bodily. But of all of the passions, Aquinas says that sorrow is most properly said to be a passion because the soul is most violently acted upon when we suffer. And there's a great overlap between the phenomenon of suffering and sorrow. So remember this notion that the passions are things that act upon us, things that we suffer. When we're talking about an actual evil present that we are suffering from, we experience sorrow over, this acts most violently upon the soul. So sorrow is the negative terminus of the concupiscible passions. This was the positive terminus, the terminus with regard to the good. Sorrow is the terminus with regard to something evil. Now, Aquinas devotes significantly less time and attention to pain than he does to sorrow. Bodily pains are better known to us than spiritual pains, but his principal goal is to understand spiritual pain, which he calls sorrow, the sorrow we experience in our soul. For the spiritual life, this interior event of pain is of greater importance than the exterior bodily experience of pain. And a person is more violently acted upon interiorly in their soul by sorrow than he is in the body. We are capable of much deeper and greater suffering in the soul than we are in the body. Think of the greatest bodily pains, the greatest bodily sufferings, and then think of the greatest kind of evils that a person might take sorrow over in their soul. You know, the most horrible kind of betrayal which our Lord experienced, of hatred, our Lord being hated by those he came to save. That is a reality that touches the core of who we are much more deeply than the most horrible bodily pain. Now, there's something very significant here about sorrow, Aquinas' understanding of sorrow. What is the cause of sorrow? The cause of sorrow is our perception of a lost good as evil. You do not experience sorrow in your soul unless you perceive that you have lost some good and that that loss is an evil to you. So if a person has lost a genuine good, something bad has happened to him. But if he doesn't perceive that he's lost that good, if he doesn't see it, apprehend it, he doesn't experience sorrow. There's a distinction here between what we could call the order of reality, things as they are in reality, and the order of apprehension, how I perceive things in my own mind. Now, in the order of reality, there's no difference between the privation of a good, the loss of a good, and the presence of an evil. But in my mind, as I apprehend reality, I could lose a good and not apprehend that as an evil, either because I misapprehend, or, for example, I do see that I've lost something, but I judge that loss to be compensated for by the acquisition of a greater good, and so that loss I don't ultimately perceive as an evil to me, and so I don't experience sorrow. To use a mundane example, I fast from food for a day. I've lost some real good, that bodily nourishment, pleasure from food, but I'm fasting from food because I want to be more deeply united to Christ. I want my soul to be have a greater capacity for openness to Him. And so my loss, my real loss of food on this day that I'm fasting is compensated for by the acquisition of a greater good. And therefore, I don't experience sorrow in that loss. I might experience some bodily pain by not eating, but I don't experience sorrow in my soul if I don't apprehend that loss as an evil to me. If I apprehend it as something in the service of a greater good, then I accept it in view of that good, and it's not something I sorrow over. What's significant here, then, is our perception of what is evil. Sorrow will not ensue unless I perceive that the lost good is an evil for me. Now, there are certainly cases where a lost good is an evil, necessarily. I lose my parents die. This is an evil. It's not a good. It's the loss of a good. And I perceive that and I sorrow over it. I have real sorrow. However, that sorrow, real as it is, may be compensated for in some way, knowing, hoping, trusting in the goodness of God and heaven for them. Nonetheless, there is a real loss, and that loss is something that I apprehend as evil. Remember, evil here is the loss of a do-good, the privation of a good. The good of my parents' lives with me in this world has been lost, and so that's an evil for me. But if I lose, say, that, friendship I was talking about that really wasn't very good, and I've come to realize this is not a good relationship, it's not helping me, it doesn't lead me to anything good, and I decide, we've got to turn away from this. Well, that loss is not something I perceive as an evil necessarily. Maybe I really perceive that as a good, even though there is a real loss there, and a loss of particular goods, but on the whole, I don't perceive it as evil. It's really significant because sorrow is such a powerful passion in life. To take some time to think about our apprehension, how we apprehend the goods that we've lost, and whether that loss really is an evil for us. At times, undoubtedly it is. But at other times, we make out certain lost goods to be more evil than they are for us. We experience more sorrow than we should because we don't see this loss in its rightful place. Okay, so I lost out on eating prime rib for dinner because sister made pork chops. Well, they're not equal, but it's really not a great evil that I've had to endure. I've lost something. My desire for prime rib was not satisfied. Sister's trying to teach me some, holy detachment, but I could really take inordinate sorrow in that and judge that to be much more of an evil for me than it really is. So in our life of sorrow, in our experience of sorrow, our consideration of how we apprehend things, you don't experience sorrow unless you apprehend the lost good to be an evil to you. You experience pain by, certain bodily things, but you don't experience sorrow in the soul except and apart from your own apprehension of the situation. And at times, Christ calls us to really change the way we see things, the way we think about things, so that while there are evils, we don't find nearly as much sorrow in them as someone who has no hope, has no belief in God, doesn't see reality as God sees it. It's not to deny the presence of evils, but to contextualize them in a right apprehension. Aquinas talks about different effects of sorrow on the soul. We'll just note what these are. Sorrow, he says, eliminates the capacity to learn. If you're really in a state of sorrow, it's very hard to sit down to a calculus book or a metaphysics book and try to learn something. Sorrow depresses the soul. So there's an interesting connection here between the movement of the passion of sorrow and the effect of depression. He's not, of course, speaking about depression in a kind of clinical way. There are certainly experiences of depression that are physiological, that involve brain chemistry and all kinds of things. But that basic kind of experience of, being depressed, I don't want to do anything, I'm so overwhelmed by sorrow, that being weighed down, depressed by sorrow, that is an effect. And again, depending on your perception of how evil this thing is or not, that may lead to greater or lesser reasonable or unreasonable kind of depression of the soul. I'm not saying that every kind of depression can be moderated by our understanding of sorrow, but some can in daily, just the experiences of daily life. Sorrow weakens all activity, he says. To be weighed down by sorrow. If you know people that are just perpetually weighed down by sorrows, and maybe they have suffered and continue to suffer the presence of great evils, it weakens activity. Whereas pleasure, the opposite here, increases activity. Finally, sorrow does harm to the body more than any other passions. Now, this apparently negative tone would seem to suggest that Aquinas considers sorrow to be bad, entirely bad for the human person, but we know this is not the case. Sorrow is a natural response, and it's the appropriate response when something which is evil to me is present. And so when used rightly, sorrow is a good. Aquinas speaks about this in terms of what he calls moderate sorrow. He says, for example, moderate sorrow contributes to the acquisition of learning, especially regarding those things, learning about those things by which man hopes to be freed from sorrow. Moderate sorrow can really help move you towards learning about what's going to get you out of your sorrow. And so he says, in the tribulation of sorrow and suffering, men are more apt to be taught by God. Sorrow is something that is meant to open us up to God. Few things are more effective in preventing a person from acquiring the habit of prayer. Few things are more effective in preventing a person from acquiring the habit of prayer than being immersed in a life of frivolous pleasures. The more that one gives oneself over to pleasure and the continual pursuit of pleasure, the more one will not be able to develop an interior life with God. But the experience of sorrow can be a salutary kind of counterweight, counterbalance to such diversions. Pleasure is good, but it can be easy to, divert ourselves too much with pleasure. Sorrow can help balance the scales a bit, and therefore open the door to growing in that interior life with God in a way that diversion and pleasure will forestall. Now, if a person lives their life trying to shun sorrow and suffering of every kind, trying to live only for pleasure, he will never, ever be able to transcend himself, to get out of himself. He will be more and more trapped in living only for himself. Sorrow, on the other hand, somewhat ironically, provides an opening to self-transcendence. Because when man seeks to understand his suffering, which human beings are uniquely capable of, and man always, in the face of great suffering, man always seeks to understand. Why? When man seeks to understand, he can come to understand that at the root, the cause of his suffering, the very root of his suffering stands a love. We would not suffer if we did not love. Sorrow is about the presence of an evil, but evil only exists as a contrary to what we love. We can come to understand, not that it takes away the experience or even diminishes the experience, but we can understand the love that stands at the root of our suffering. St. Catherine of Siena says that dwelling in the cell of self-knowledge requires us to embrace suffering and sorrow, that suffering and sorrow increase in proportion to love. When love grows, so does sorrow. The more you love, the more you will experience sorrow in this life because of your love, and because there are obstacles to that love, things that work against it, even the natural things of death. The more you love a person, the more you will have sorrow when that person's earthly life comes to an end. The more love grows, the more sorrow grows. There's an intimate connection between these two passions, love and sorrow. Love's at the root of every passion, but especially sorrow, which we experience so strongly. It can help us to see what we really love. It can be another helpful point of self-examination. If I really have sorrow over something, it should make me ask the question, well, what is it that I love that I'm really sorrowing over? And is this love a good love for me? Am I sorrowing over the loss of something that I really shouldn't be sorrowing over? Or, indeed, it points out strong and profound loves that are rooted in our soul. For both St. Thomas and St. Catherine, sorrow flows from the human capacity for love. It is not something that we should seek to medicate out of existence. If you medicate sorrow out of existence, you diminish your capacity to love. If you grow in love, you will grow in sorrow in this life. But we live in the hope that in the life to come, in beatitude, every tear and suffering will be wiped away, and love will be all in all. There will be no possibility of loss of that which we love in heaven. It is natural, however, and appropriate to seek certain remedies for sorrow. So Aquinas lists certain remedies for sorrow. Pleasure. Pleasure is the natural corollary to sorrow. So if you're in a state of sorrow, it could be that, you should seek out some appropriate pleasure. Instead of just being weighed down by sorrow, seek out some good, wholly appropriate pleasure, and it can provide some relief, at least while the pleasure lasts. While the prime rib lasts, sister, write that down. Another remedy to sorrow is weeping. There really can be a kind of somatic release from weeping. It's natural. It's a natural response, bodily response to sorrow in the soul. And it can provide a kind of, I don't know if I'm sure you've had the experience of weeping profoundly. Even physically, it provides a certain kind of relief. A certain weight is released. The sorrow isn't gone altogether, but it is a certain natural remedy. The sympathy of friends is a remedy for sorrow. Sorrow can all too often lead us to isolation. But to seek out the good of friendship in our sorrow doesn't necessarily mean we need to share our sorrows. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we do too much. Sometimes we need to. Other times we don't. But to seek out the good of human friendship. The contemplation of truth, he says, is the highest remedy for sorrow. To look upon Christ crucified, to contemplate the truth of divine love, of divine goodness, of our destiny. It can help recontextualize the picture. Sorrow ultimately is something finite. Love is something infinite. And contemplating the truth of God's love can help recontextualize. This sorrow will not last forever. As great and as weighty as it might be, it will come to an end. Then he speaks about sleep and baths as well as bodily remedies for sorrow. Take a hot bath and get a long sleep, and it can provide a little rest to your body. So in giving sorrow a positive value, Aquinas is applying his general teaching here that the passions are natural to man, and when governed by reason, the passions, including sorrow, serve the authentic good of man. If there is evil, and if I experience evil, then there is cause for sorrow in my life. If I didn't experience sorrow at the presence of evil, something would really be wrong with me in my apprehension. If I never experience sorrow, if I really love someone and that person dies a tragic and very early death, if I don't experience sorrow, well, what does that say about my love? Do I really have love? This is a natural part of our human life. So that is a brief overview of Aquinas' teaching on these 6 passions, these 6 different ways that we respond to goods and evils in our lives, these 6 natural responses. This is a kind of psychological study here that is meant to help us to analyze our own lives, to think about how I respond to things. Someone said to me, it's very easy to experience all kinds of passions because of all the different ways that people push my buttons. People get me agitated and upset. But the more and more we think about the passions and how they work, the more and more we realize that regardless of what the external stimulus is, the external impetus, if I respond with a disordered passion, it's my problem. It's because of a problem in me. It's not because this external stimulus made me respond in a disordered way. It gave rise to a passion, but that passion didn't need to be inordinate, say like immoderate anger. We can come to see that, okay, my problems are really my problems, and I have to stop blaming, others, the situation around me, the circumstances, because Jesus and Our Lady would not have responded in the way that I responded to these stimuli. They would have had a response. Christ was angry when he went into the temple and saw them profaning the sacred. But that anger was an appropriate anger, as we'll talk about next time. It was not immoderate. It wasn't sinful. It was the appropriate response, whereas we can all too easily hold on to vengeance and want to, set up the guillotine and behead these people. But that's about something disordered in me, something that needs to be healed in me. So I need to take examination of myself and how I do respond to things. And is it rightly ordered? Is it immoderate? And then, as we'll talk about next week, we'll at least look at the virtues that are meant to reorder these passions so that we can respond. We do need to respond. We naturally respond to external stimuli, but we can respond in a holy way, in a rightly ordered way, as Christ would. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of great reading, further reading that you can do on Aquinas on the passions. There are some more recent studies, but they're very academic. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them. It's not a topic that's received a lot of attention. However, one of the reasons I asked for your email addresses is that I do have a PDF here, about 50 pages that I'll send you. It's from a book that I recommended last fall. What is it called? Maybe some of you ended up getting it. It's called A Course in Thomistic Ethics by D.Q. McInerney. It's a very good book on the whole of the moral life, Aquinas' understanding the moral life. But there are a few chapters, about 50 pages, that I scanned on the passions, which are very helpful, kind of walking in greater detail through Aquinas' teaching. So I can send that to you, and maybe next week think about a few other books that might be helpful as well if you want to read more about these things. But any questions, discussion? We have at least 10 minutes. We'll end officially at 11:50 if anyone wants to go to Mass, but I'm happy to stay longer for discussion. Yes?
You talked about the four moral types and
Yes.
being virtuous, the top. Is it possible while we're still human beings living to be virtuous enough that you really don't experience sorrow and anger and...
Remember, it's not that you don't experience them. You do experience them, but you don't experience them in any disordered way. You always experience them as Christ did, but you experience them as rightly ordered. And yes, it is absolutely possible to have virtue in this life by grace, not by our own actions alone, but we certainly can have the virtues. We'll talk about these virtues next week, the virtues of temperance. Temperance governs the concupiscible, and the virtue of fortitude governs the irascible. So it doesn't mean that you won't experience passions. You will always, but you'll experience them as they should be experienced. Any other questions?
What would be some good readings for the virtuous?
Yes, that's a good question. And next week I'll bring a few recommendations for reading about the virtues of temperance and fortitude. I can give those to you, send those to you next week. I'll put that on my list. Any other questions about these passions? Yes? Okay, good. Now, envy is interesting. Envy, so remember that Aquinas, she asked about envy and jealousy. We'll consider envy. There's perhaps a distinction between them, but remember that Aquinas considers these 11 passions as the primary passions, but he says there are others. The primary passions, the fundamental passions, are natural, part of our being. He does say that the passion of envy is an example. It's the only example he gives. It is an example of a passion that is always and everywhere evil. Envy is not a natural passion. Envy is something that came into existence because of our fallen state. It's not part of the natural design of our soul. Envy is a species of sorrow. Envy is a species of sorrow, but it's an evil sorrow. It's sorrow at the good of another. I find sorrow in the fact that she has this good and that I don't. So to have envy for another is always an evil movement of the passion of sorrow. We should rejoice in the good of another. Even though I don't have that good, we shouldn't see it as something that her possession of it is not a lack for me.
All the way back to love, you talked about the perception of good,
Yes.
which makes me think of moral relativism, and where do you get truth?
Yes,
And
we haven't been able to really address this. It's kind of the whole other half of this. How we apprehend what we apprehend. Because what we're talking about here is not really the intellect. We're talking about what he calls sense perception. It happens in the soul, these interior senses. We have the exterior senses by which we bring the data in, but then there are these interior senses by which we collate it. So I see all these different things and I collate that. I see that's a person, that's the color black, white. And then there is an interior sense by which we make a judgment about the goodness, the usefulness of something, or the evil of it. And that, he calls it the cogitative sense. It's not the intellect. That is something that can suffer its own disorder, such that I apprehend something to be good for me that's not good for me. That's a difficult thing, and it gives rise to a lot of problems. This is why the apprehension of the intellect needs to supersede. Okay, maybe my senses tell me that arsenic is good for me, but my intellect needs to supersede and say, no, doesn't matter that you've apprehended this good, you've made a mistake, and you can't always change those mistakes. This gets into for one example, the very difficult realm of the apprehension of sexual desire and disordered sexual desire. The apprehension of that, someone apprehending something as desirable sexually, which in fact is contrary to right reason and their true good, but they apprehend it that way. And undoing that is a very difficult business. But right reason needs to intervene and say no. Regardless of how you see things, how you experience this, how you apprehend it, you know that this is contrary to your true good. You know it's against the law of God. This is another realm of the effects of original sin, and one that's not so easily remedied because it doesn't come under the control of the voluntary, as the passions ultimately do. So one last thing to say that's important, you can apprehend something as good for you that's not good for you, but just because you've apprehended that doesn't mean you have to love it, have a passionate movement, because reason can intervene and say, no, this isn't something you should love. Yes, you might be attracted to it because of a disordered attraction at the sense appetite that you can't really change in yourself, but you don't have to move forward to desire, to love and desire. You can, reason and will can intervene there. It gets complicated, but yes, sister.
If I remember correctly, you said you have to love something to have zeal.
Yes,
Okay.
That's right.
How can you develop zeal? Because I know a lot of people who don't have the zeal to do what they need to do. So how do you develop
It's an interesting question, because Aquinas thinks zeal is a natural effect of love. That the more strongly you love, the more you will be impelled, necessarily, in zeal. So if zeal is not very strong, he would say that what you need to develop is your love.
Okay.
And that the more, think about a mother for her child. I mean, the most natural zeal and the natural level we have is a mother will stand in the way of any obstacle to the child's good, at the cost of her own life. Because that love is so strong that she'll be moved in zeal, no question. But if you're not moved in zeal, well, that really says something about your love. Do you really love you're willing to let the person suffer something that's contrary to their good? Or any other questions? Sister, I have a question. When are we having prime rib?
I'm going to give you some this week, I promise.
No tripe, no tripe. All right, thank you, friends. We'll see you next week. God bless you. Thank you.